Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. Michaux State Forest is the place I spend the most time outdoors. Located about 30 miles from where I live, it's where I hike and camp. It's where I bring visitors to show off the South Mountain region. It's where I breathe in the fresh air and explore the beauty of the Commonwealth. It's my safe place away from the goings-on of Harrisburg. But that safety was shattered in April 2025. I received text messages from friends telling me that Michaux was on fire. Then, news came that there were 2 fires, and they were spreading. With wind and no rain in the forecast, it became evident that the situation could get bad quickly. Over the following 2 weeks, I'd see photos and videos of the fire spreading across the forest I loved. Friends were evacuated from their homes, roads were closed, massive clouds of smoke billowed across the area. People were scared. The beautiful landscape I loved was on fire, and there was nothing I could do but watch. But thanks to the incredibly brave firefighters and a little help from the weather, the Thompson Hollow and Hammond Rocks fires were extinguished in 14 days. Over 150 fire companies from 10 Pennsylvania and Maryland counties battled the blaze. Approximately 2,700 acres were destroyed by the wildfires. Luckily, no homes or private property were damaged and only 2 people suffered minor injuries. And predictably, a determination was made that the fires were human-caused, like 99% of all wildfires. Here's the thing. While the situation was scary for many in the area, even for us 40 minutes away from the fires, this is a common occurrence in Pennsylvania. There's between 1,000 and 2,000 wildfires every year in the Commonwealth, and the majority of those wildfires occur in the spring. These fires so close to home was a sobering reminder of the ever-present danger of wildfires. With Michaux still charred from the fires, I want to know more about wildfires and the wildland firefighters that have to put them out. I'm excited to welcome Mike Kern to the podcast. Mike is the Chief Forest Fire Warden for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Mike, thanks so much for joining the program.
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here. Always glad to talk about wildfire and related issues in Pennsylvania.
What first drew you to wildland firefighting?
Well, I went to school for forestry and got a job with the Bureau of Forestry pretty quickly thereafter. And it was immediately apparent that one of the main things the Bureau of Forestry does is prevent and suppress wildfires. So I got involved. I was interested in it. It was kind of an extension of public service, and I've been involved for over 20 years now.
What kind of training do wildland firefighters go through before they're ready to hit the line?
Yeah, so there's the basic fire training for wildfire is about 40 hours. So it fills up a whole week essentially. But they go over everything from weather. That weather is a big part of wildfires, wind, humidity, temperature, that sort of thing. So, if it's raining, obviously you're not going to have fires. So weather's really important. A lot of safety. Safety is the other big thing. Just keeping people safe. That's one of the main reasons we do fire training, is to keep people safe. It's not so much to always, we do want to make them good firefighters and make them efficient and able to do a good job, but it's also to keep themselves safe, keep the public safe, and make sure, where there is a fire, everybody goes home. And then, all kinds of other stuff, land navigation, use of hand tools, working with equipment. There's a myriad amount of topics there, but basically you give people all that in a week and they're ready to at least go out and be on a fire in a basic firefighter role.
Can you tell us about the DCNR wildland firefighting efforts? What do you do? What do your crews do?
Yeah, we have wildfire protection responsibilities for all the state and private local lands in the Commonwealth. So other than the federal lands, we have wildfire protection responsibilities, and we have, over the decades, the state's organized around a system of 20 forest districts. So basically every acre of the state's in one forest district or another, and that local district is responsible to protect that area from wildfire. And they do, we have anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5 fire staff in each district that do fire full time. Their main job is to work with local fire departments, work with the counties, their local wardens, to be prepared, trained, equipped, organized. And then when fires do occur, those people are the primary responders that are going out to fires, trying to help get things organized and accomplished in a safe manner, and they also responsible to do fire investigations. So we determine what caused the fire, where it started, who started it. If humans cause almost 99% of the wildfires in Pennsylvania. So there's very few natural cause fires. The main natural cause in Pennsylvania would be lightning. But most fires are caused by people. So if we determine the individual that started a fire, they would be responsible for the costs that we have to put the fire out. And that can be a small amount, or it can be a really large amount. So it's just important for people to be cognizant of those things and be careful with fire and not have to deal with any kind of unwanted impacts afterwards, financially, or, just that's in addition to all the other obvious public safety risks and any liability, that the individual could incur if they cause a fire.
When it's a human caused fire, how many times would you say that it's purposeful, or was it neglectful? I mean, what are they usually doing that leads to these fires?
I'd say maybe 20% of our fires are what I would call intentional, which, could be considered arson, which is, we have between 1 and 2,000 wildfires reported in Pennsylvania a year. So, maybe, yeah, it's a pretty large amount.
That's crazy. I had no idea. That's so many.
Quite a bit of fires. It's a big state. There's, if you count, I think the entire Commonwealth with all the cities and all the agriculture areas and everything is 29 million acres. So it's a very large area. There is a lot of wildfire in the state. On dry days in our peak spring fire season, there can be 50 to 85 fires in a day across the Commonwealth. Now, most of those fires are small, a quarter acre, like a residential lot size or smaller. But somebody still has to respond to them.
Yeah.
And put them out. And, we always say too, all the big fires all started small. They just got bigger, but they all start small. Some are kept small and some grow to pretty large size. So getting back to your original question, a lot of fires are accidental. Probably half of them could be considered negligent by the legal definition of negligence. I don't think people intend to be negligent. A lot of times we just hear people, oh, I never realized it would get away, or I never realized it would spread so fast. Never realized it would, damage my house or my neighbor's garage or whatever happened. But a lot of it just comes down to people are burning or using fire on a day they shouldn't be. It's too dry and too windy, or they don't have any clearance. They're burning. I just read a report this morning. They were burning brush, and there was dead dry grass right up against the burn pile, and then it got away. Well, in hindsight, that wasn't a good idea. You have to have some clearance between combustible materials, or your fire is just going to escape. And if you're not right there with some water or a hose or some kind of tool to put it out, you're going to be helpless to stop it, and it's going to get away before you can react.
Is spring the busiest time for forest fires?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, spring is the busiest time, specifically in April. We have a lot of fires in March, and we can have fires into early May, but generally it's that period when winter's gone and the vegetation is still dead and dormant until, now it's May 20th. Everything's lush and green. It's very hard to get green grass or green tree leaves to burn because of all the moisture in them.
Mm-hmm.
It's when it's brown and dormant that is the highest risk for escape. We also do have a kind of a secondary season in the fall. Fall of 2024, we had a lot of wildfire also, but it was hot and dry and didn't rain for several weeks. So we have fires in this state anytime it's dry enough to burn, but generally spring is the big time.
Speaking of that, recently there were 2 fires burning at the same time in Michaux State Forest that caused about 2,700 acres of damage. Can you tell us about those fires and the effort that went into containing them?
Yeah, there were 2 large fires in the Michaux in April. It was a kind of a similar situation as I just described, but it had been dry. We had a lot of fire in March, and then we had a little bit of a reprieve in early April where we got some rain, but it got hot and dry again and windy.
Yeah.
Very fast. We're still, I think it's alleviated now, but we were still suffering from some lingering drought from the past fall, where we went weeks and weeks without a lot of rain. And then we had a relatively warm and open winter. And so all that kind of, I think, came to a head in late April. And we had two human caused fires that started down on the South Mountain, and it took, I don't know exactly how many, definitely took at least 4 or 5 to 10 days of pretty prolonged effort by a lot of human beings to get those fires under control. There was a strong support from the local county emergency management agency and also the local fire departments working with our wardens and our staff to put those fires out. We brought in staff from across the state from DCNR that are trained in wildland fire, and use those people along with the local resources to help out get those fires under control.
Yeah, it's one of those things that was that fire was taking place about 20 minutes away from where I live, and you start seeing the reports and you see that it's growing, and you look into the forecast and you're like, all there is wind and there's no rain coming for days. I mean, what does it feel like when you have an operation like that to take care of, when you're not getting any breaks in terms of you're not going to get the weather that you want?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, but it's also, you feel like, at least from my perspective, it's like, okay, this is what we're here for. This is what we've trained for. This is why we've invested so much time and effort to be ready for this. So it's our job. We're going to stick with it till the situation's resolved. Either we put the fire out or it rains and Mother Nature does it for us. But either way, we got to own it and do the best we can with it. I think the thing that I think about is wildfire is a team effort. Nobody's doing it themselves. There's a couple thousand fires in the Commonwealth every year. I'm not going to go put those out myself. You chuckle, but
Sure.
It's a team effort, and we have a lot of people. We have a lot of cooperators, and people are willing to help when there's real significant emergencies. We can have a lot of resources we can bring to bear, and cooperative relationships we have that we've established that aren't accidental. They're intentional relationships that we've invested in and agreements we've invested in, and all those things that are really boring and administrative, but having people that are ready to come help you out when you need them is important. So it's, like I said, you invest in the work ahead of time, the emergencies go better. And you certainly learn where you need to invest more time in the future to address the other issues.
Yeah, I'm sure that's one of those things with forest fires where it's like everyone you probably learn a little something, if not for a staff member, if not on an organizational or department level. There's just something that you learn every time.
Yeah, it can be. I remember when I was starting out, it can be as simple as, oh, these boots are really crappy. I need to get better boots.
Yeah.
Or my hard hat, the suspension's broke, and I need to get that replaced. Or it can be agency wide or organizational things where, hey, we don't have enough staff here, or our equipment needs replaced, or we need to upgrade our aircraft contracts or whatever they are. Yeah, there's all kinds of lessons learned, and we always we try to find out what those lessons are and improve for the future. I had heard a unique quote a long time ago: fire gives you the test before you get the lesson. So you get tested, and then you say, oh, that didn't work, or that was a terrible idea. I've had a few of those moments myself, and we're always trying to learn and continuously improve what we're doing.
You spoke a little bit about the staff that you have available. How much do you rely on local fire companies when situations occur?
We rely tremendously on local fire companies, and we also have a network of local forest fire wardens that can have a crew, and many of those people are also in local fire departments. So it's kind of a mix, but for that initial response, we have a tremendous partnership there. If you think about Pennsylvania, you call 911, it goes to the county. What usually happens if you call 911 for a fire? Obviously, local fire departments gets dispatched first, and they're usually the first ones on scene. And Pennsylvania still has a pretty tremendous local fire service that's very dedicated and is always responds as to the best of their abilities. So We try to work with them, support them. We have a volunteer fire assistance grant program, and we also try to work with them locally and cooperate, through our local fire staff.
And from what I understand from the Michaux State Forest fires, that there was no property damage in terms of people's homes or anything like that, and that there were only two injuries.
Yeah, there were two, I mean, relatively minor. Uh, I'm sure they were not minor to the people that experienced them, but in the grand scheme of things, pretty uh, low level recoverable injuries to some local responders early on in the fire. And there were no others, like no significant other injuries or loss of life. I'm not aware of any homes or structures that were lost or damaged. There were some for a little bit of time there, and there was some evacuations, especially specifically around the Thompson Hollow fire. There were homes that are essentially inside the footprint of the fire now. Um, but there was a pretty significant effort by our resources and those local resources and use of our aircraft and to keep those fires away from those homes.
Well, as somebody who has friends in that area and somebody who loves going to Michaux State Forest and Pine Grove Furnace State Park, I just want to thank you and your crews for doing everything that you did. It's pretty remarkable how hard you guys had to work to be able to control that thing. So thank you.
Okay, we appreciate it. I'm sure I'll pass that on to all the staff, and I know there's been a kind of an outpouring of support. And I also talked to some of our folks, and they're kind of like, well, we're doing our job, which is it's what we signed up to do, and I get that, but it's nice to know that there is a lot of support and people care about what you're doing and feel it's worthwhile thing to do.
When a forest fire is reported, what are the first steps that must be taken?
Well, I mean, the first step, you got to know where the fire's at. We have to know what generally we try to. I mean, a lot of our emergency services operate by closest resources concept. So we want to know who's the closest, who can get there first. You get usually with a fire, you want a wildfire, you want to get a, a small or limited number of people on scene to find out what's going on. We call it a size up. So you find out where the fire's at, where's it burning, what fuels are there to burn, what's at risk. We call it values at risk. So are there homes, are there power lines? There can be all kinds of stuff, communications, structures, sensitive natural resources. What's at risk, and what's the probability of this fire? You know, is it going to get large? Is it relatively going to be easy to contain? You know, a small fire, your initial response might be enough to put it out. And so it's just a matter of getting people on scene, uh, determining, what the fire's doing and what else is needed to bring it under control.
So, can you walk us through what firefighters do to put out a fire? I mean, I covered as a reporter, I must have covered 100 house fires, but I don't remember ever covering like a wildfire.
So in the basic fire training, there's a concept called the fire triangle, where a fire is essentially a chemical reaction that involves heat, oxygen, and fuel. And fuel being something to burn. So the way you put a fire out is to break the fire triangle. You either take the heat away, take the oxygen away, or take the fuel away. And if you take one of those three away, the fire's going to extinguish. So you can take the heat away. You obviously water, put water in the fire, cools it down. You can't always get water to a wildfire. If you think about a fire burning out in an area, that there's not always a trail or a road where you can drive right to the fire and put it out. So you might have to take the oxygen away, is basically smothering. There's some different, techniques you can do. You can use dirt in a pinch, kind of a primitive method, but it does work at times. Or what we usually do in a fire, and what the easiest to do, or the most effective, is to take the fuel away. So you'll hear talk about a fire lines or containment lines. You're basically raking or shoveling or digging, anything from hand tools to a bulldozer, taking the fuel away from the edge of the fire and then the fire will burn until it hits that area of no fuel, and then it'll stop because there's nothing left to burn. So that fire line can be either put in by humans, or you can use natural barriers, streams, um, or unnatural barriers, like man-made barriers, roads, trails, power lines, any cleared area, that sort of thing. So you're basically trying to break that fire triangle and stop that chemical reaction from continuing. A fire will continue to burn until it either hits a barrier, or it gets rained on, or it runs out of fuel, what have you, or humans take in action to stop it.
Can you tell us about fire containment? What does it mean when we hear that a fire is 50% contained or something like that?
Yeah, so if a fire was 50% contained, that would mean 50% of the perimeter has some type of barrier around it that is a pretty high probability of stopping the fire or holding it. We're not saying a fire is extinguished, and I think sometimes people think, oh, fire's 50% contained, so half of it's out. That's not really true. It means that half of the perimeter has basically secure lines in that are going to have a high probability of holding that fire there. I think the other thing I see is, fire. It's not like a football game where there's a scoreboard and you get to the fire and it says, okay, it's 0% contained, and then it starts going 1, 2, 3%.
Yeah.
That just doesn't happen. You have to take those actions, and then people have to go out and say, okay, there's this much perimeter. If there's whatever 10,000 feet of perimeter, and we have 4,000 feet that we feel are contained, okay, it's 40%. But people have to go out and figure that out, and it can be a challenge if you're just getting to a fire, you don't know exactly how big it is, or the other thing I've seen on rapidly expanding fires, it's very difficult to say, okay, this is where the perimeter is, because it's constantly moving.
Yeah.
And especially the Thompson Hollow fire on that Thursday was growing quite a bit. It's kind of an exponential growth. It's a tenth of an acre, and then it's 1 acre, and then it's 10 acres. It's not linear. So things are expanding, and you're having to deal with the fire and try to figure out what's contained. And it can be challenging as events are unfolding, and it's a very dynamic environment at times.
Yeah, I bet. What does a fire investigation look like? Like, how can an investigator determine if the fire was natural or human caused?
Yeah, so to investigate a wildfire, if you go take training on that, there's a lot of what they call indicators. So when the fire burns, the different scorch patterns or charring. If you're trained in those indicators, you can actually trace the fire back to where it started. And that's an important part of investigation, is finding what we call the origin, where the fire originated, where it started. And you trace the fire back to where it started, and then at the origin, you look for evidence. So is there a lightning strike there? If there's no lightning storms and there's no evidence of a lightning strike at the origin, we can rule out lightning, essentially, which means we're ruling out natural causes. In Pennsylvania, at least, there aren't too many natural causes of fire in the world. Lightning and volcanoes being the two main. We don't have volcanoes here, so it's essentially lightning. I've seen some rare cases of spontaneous combustion, of where vegetation rots and gets hot, but that's usually either hay or mulch or some other type of thick organic matter. So that's you could argue whether that's natural or not, if it's things that humans put there. But anyway, so you look for evidence at the origin. If there's is there a campfire ring there where the fire originated from a campfire? Is there a brush pile there? Or the classic in Pennsylvania is the backyard burn barrel. If there's a burn barrel and all the indicators lead back to the burn barrel at the origin, then you can determine that somebody was burning there. Or whatever, other evidence. If it's equipment use, there could be like where a metal track on a bulldozer hit a rock, or there'll be a mark there where that happened, and there will be the origin of the fire immediately adjacent to that. So it's all about where the fire originated, and then what evidence is there And generally we use a scientific method. So we're actually looking for things we can rule out. For example, if you find a fire origin and there's no railroad tracks there, you can say, well, it wasn't a train because there's no railroad tracks here. Or if there's no road, it wasn't probably a vehicle because you can't drive a vehicle, out through the woods without a road. So it's kind of a process of elimination. And then some fires, you don't find any evidence, and you say, well, there's 2 or 3 causes that could have been involved, but we can't necessarily rule all of these out.
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. Join the Keystone Trails Association's trail care team to show some love to the trails you love. KTA organizes hands-on stewardship events and training workshops to maintain and expand hiking trails in Pennsylvania. You can find a trail care event near you. Check out KTA's schedule of events online at kta-hike.org. Are you looking for your next adventure? Unlock some of the best landscapes in Pennsylvania with incredibly detailed, highly curated waterproof trail maps from the folks at Purple Lizard. They create extraordinary maps of Pennsylvania State Forest for people who love to explore the outdoors. Find them at your local outfitters, bike shops, and bookstores, or visit purplelizard.com, where your next adventure begins. Refresh your love of Pennsylvania State Parks and Forests this spring with the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation. Stay in the know by finding events on Meetup or their website, signing up for their weekly e-newsletter, following them on social media, joining a local friends group, or accessing resources online at paparksandforests.org. Together, we can help conserve Pennsylvania's natural resources, support education, and remove barriers to an inclusive outdoor experience for everyone. Looking for a way to add some local Pennsylvania flair to your space? Check out Sisters Sunflowers. They create unique stickers inspired by small local spaces that make your community shine. From quirky caves to hidden local gems, their stickers bring your favorite places to life. Perfect for your laptop, water bottle, or anywhere that needs a little hometown love. For both locals and visitors, there's stickers, magnets, prints, and more celebrating Pennsylvania's most iconic parks and forests. And for the more avid explorers, there's even a hand-drawn poster to keep track of the Pennsylvania State Parks and Forests that you've been to. Use the code HELLBENDER15 at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Support local, inspire adventure, and decorate with meaning. Only at Sisters Sunflowers. Shop now and celebrate the places that make your hometown special. All right, back to the show. What does a typical day look like during fire season, or is there even such a thing as a typical day?
I mean, there's kind of a typical routine. And it's different depending on your role in the program. My typical day in fire season is probably a lot different than the firefighters that are out there on the ground responding. But generally, in the morning is kind of the quiet time for wildfire, unless there's fires from the previous day. But generally in the morning, you're looking at weather forecasts. You're trying to determine what the fire danger is for today. How wet are things or how dry are things? What's the fire danger? Is there an immediate risk today, or is it more, down the road risk? Is it raining or not? You're looking at weather. You're looking at what staff you have available. What's the status of your employees? What's the status of our equipment? Is any of it broke down? What's the status of our, do we have aircraft on contract? In the spring fire season, we have helicopters and fixed wing air tankers available in Pennsylvania. So what's their status? Are they operational? Did they fly last night? All that stuff. And then you kind of put that into your situational awareness, and you know what the weather is, what our resources are, what we can expect. Wildfires in general, there's a higher risk in the afternoon because you have the daytime drying, solar radiation is a big factor in the fires. Winds in this part of the country, the winds are generally higher in the afternoon and they die down at night, and that's due to that daytime heating of the air and all that meteorological stuff. So the afternoons when fire activity picks up, if you're dealing with human-caused fires like we are, it's often after 4 p.m. And I think that's because of, folks are working during the day and then they get home and they're doing things at their property or their residence in the afternoon after work. So you can kind of expect fire activity, to be heaviest from say 2 p.m. to 5, 6, depending on how the length of daylight at the time, even as late as 8 p.m. See a lot of fires die down overnight. The humidity generally comes up, the winds die down, and sometimes you can get a handle on things after sunset here. But sometimes you can't. Depends on the weather that day and what's going on.
Is there a particularly memorable moment or situation that you can recall from a bad fire?
In in Pennsylvania, I had a few things. Was thinking back to 2023. There was a fire in Luzerne County that burned up against the northeast extension of the turnpike, and we did have to talk to the Turnpike Commission, have them shut the road down that night for about 6 hours, and that was a pretty big deal because you're impeding people's ability to travel and delaying commerce and all those sorts of fun things. So uh, that one was pretty memorable. And in 2016, there was a large fire of about 8 or 9,000 acres in the Poconos and Pike and Monroe County, and we had to bring in a substantial amount of out-of-state resources for that fire, and that was a pretty trying time when that was all going on. And I remember being on the phone with some people talking about, okay, we don't have enough here. We have everything we have available at the fire, and it's not enough. So we're going to have to ask for some other help. So, those were pretty memorable just because they were kind of at the higher end of the spectrum, I guess. So,
What roles do fire towers play in wildland firefighting?
yeah, so fire towers are essentially for fire detection. You're trying to spot a fire before it, when it's developing and before it gets large. And they play a big role in areas where we have maybe poor or low cell phone coverage. A lot of fires in populated areas get called in now. People driving down the road see a fire, they call 911 pretty quickly. But we do have, more needs for detection in those remote areas of Pennsylvania or areas where there's not good coverage or lower populations, just because there's less people to call those fires in. So we do think fire towers still have a role to play in certain parts of the state. I don't think they're needed, everywhere, but they do have a role, and there is a value. We don't staff fire towers as continuously as used to be done. It's more of a as needed or in those really bad fire days where it's helpful to have somebody up there in the afternoon looking for any new fires.
Yeah, because sometimes you could think of like how they do it out west, where they have people that literally live in fire towers for months on end. That's not something that we need here in Pennsylvania, or that we do here in Pennsylvania.
That was the model, maybe 100 years ago or 80 years ago. But these, travel's improved. People were able to get around. Even in Pennsylvania, 1915 or whatever, you had to maybe take a horse to get to a fire tower. And so it was a pretty big investment of your time and energy to get there. And now, a lot of them you can drive to in relatively short amount of time. So you can go staff them for the day. And like I said, it's really those afternoons in Pennsylvania that are the concern. So you can staff your fire towers in the afternoon and be ready and know what's going on. The towers out west too, it's just such a more remote area. If you think about some of those wilderness areas or Yellowstone National Park's around 1 million acres itself. So it's just more remote. It's harder to get to. It's more efficient to have somebody stay there than if you're going to go in and out and it takes you 2 or 3 days to get there. You can't do that every day, obviously. So you're going to have to stay.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions the public has about wildland firefighting?
Yeah, I actually, I had wrote some of this stuff down. I talked about the containment and the scoreboard. It's not a football game. There's no scoreboard. It's like we're basically trying to put the fire out safely. The size of the fire, I hate to say it doesn't matter too much because it's obviously the bigger the fire is, the more people it can impact. But the main goal is to put the fire out safely, protect firefighter and public safety. The size of the fire is somewhat independent of that. We want to do it safely. You might have to have a bigger fire to do it safely by using natural barriers, but that's kind of a tactical decision. The one other thing I hear a lot is, our highest risk for fires in this state is in the spring and then in the fall. It's not in the summer. Summer is fire season out west, but it's a completely different weather pattern. They have hot, dry summers with little precipitation. And here, our fuels are generally green and growing in the summer, and there's a regular, relatively regular precipitation. So unless we have a drought, our summer fire season is not the highest risk. And the other thing I've heard lately that I didn't really ever pick up on before, but there's seems to be this thought that, oh, if it's hot and dry, fires just happen, and they don't. They don't just happen. In this state, fires are caused by something. Um, it's either human caused or natural caused, but there's generally some kind of spark that initiates a fire. There has to be what they call an ignition. Something has to ignite a fire, but the forest will not just catch on fire magically because it's hot and dry that day. I don't know. I don't know where some of this stuff comes from, but it's there's usually some type of ignition.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that things combust out of nowhere just because it's hot now just seems a little ridiculous.
Yeah. The other thing I would want to say along those lines too, that DCNR really is we're trying to protect the Commonwealth. We are not out there setting fires. We don't want fires to happen because wildfires are a risk to life and property. We do controlled burns, and there are other agencies in the state that do controlled burns, but those are done in a specific area with what we call a prescription, and they're done by trained people with the best intentions to keep the fire in that area that we're trying to burn. So the prescribed fire and wildfire, while they're related, they are also completely different in their intentions and how they're set out. But DCNR is not trying to cause wildfires. We're not trying to take people's land or damage people's land. We are trying to protect life and property when wildfires do occur.
And speaking of prescribed burns, I've seen them done in Shenandoah National Park. They do it every year to the meadow. What is a prescribed burn? What does that look like for when it's done here in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, prescribed burns are often called controlled burns. And so the idea is that you have an area that could benefit from some fire, either to, one of the main things you can do is burn an area under controlled conditions, and then it won't be able to burn under uncontrolled conditions if there's a wildfire there, or if the fire does happen 2, 3, 4 years out, it would hopefully have less intensity because you've already burned that area once or multiple times. And so it kind of keeps those, what they call the fuel loading, how much combustible materials out there in the forest, keeps it somewhat under control. You can burn to do things like improve wildlife habitat or even manage the vegetation that's growing on a site. Some trees and plants are adapted to fire and they will regenerate well with fire, and some trees and plants are not adapted to fire and will not regenerate well with fire. So you can actually do some manipulation of what's going to grow there in the future by introducing fire or keeping fire out. It all depends on what the management objectives are for that particular land area and what humans want to see happen there.
And I know prescribed burns or controlled burns have been something that have been done for hundreds of years. I know the Native Americans used to do them well before we ever got here.
Yeah. You think about fire, humans have been using fire for a long time. And I think there was probably a lot more fire in the state before the colonization from Europeans than we realize. And we have, tree species like pitch pine and some other species that have evolved with fire for probably thousands of years. And I think we humans tend to think that, everything that happened is what is in my frame of reference and what I remember. And that's certainly not the case with fire. There's been fire for millennia in Pennsylvania in the spring. And I would expect that will probably continue for the foreseeable future or even past the foreseeable future. Just because of the way it's all based on, climate, topography, where you are in the world, prevailing winds, weather patterns, all that sort of thing. So,
how do climate change and longer fire seasons affect the work that you do?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is fire the spring starts earlier. So the past couple years, we've had a lot of fire activity in February, and that's only really going to occur if you have an open winter and without a lot of snow. And so far, it starts earlier in the spring. Now, we had thought, I think the prevailing thoughts were, oh, fire season in the spring might shift, but it'll end earlier. But we still haven't been seeing that too much. It still seems like, the prime period is still April into May, but we do have activity occurring earlier, February, March, sometimes. We did see some drought 2023, 24 drought in the summer, especially 2023. Lots of fire activity in the summer and early fall. So that's been kind of different. I don't know. I guess the question's in my mind, is that a trend or is that just a kind of a cycle? Because we've seen cycles in Pennsylvania. If you look at the data, the 30s, the 60s, late 90s, there's been these periods where fire increased for maybe 5 or 10 years. So I guess the question on my mind is this, is it a natural cycle or is this more of a long-term trend? But since 2020, especially, we've seen fire activity kind of ratchet up just one or two notches each year. And so that's my concern long-term is, if things ratchet up a little bit each year for the next 10 or 20 years, that's a serious issue. And so that's, I hate to say, we'll see, because we got to prepare for that. But, we are kind of watching that to see if it's a long-term trend or more of just a natural cycle. The other thing, fires start early in the spring. They may last longer into the fall, depending on when that, generally you're looking late fall here, winter weather, it gets cold and rainy, and that kind of shuts fire season down for the winter. But if we don't get that, or if we get temperatures up in the 80s in November, then, we're probably going to have more fires at that time because the vegetation is dormant by that then again.
How has the approach to managing wildfires changed over the years?
I think I mentioned a little bit about, the size of the fire is not the concern so much as the safety. I think that's a big change. At one time it was, we got to put these fires out as small as possible, as quickly as possible. And, now I think our philosophy now has shifted more towards, we got to put these fires out as safely as possible. And then they are what they are otherwise. But, safety can involve keeping a fire small. It depends what's at risk. And so I think that's been a big change that I've seen over my career, is looking at what's at risk. What is this fire threatening? Generally the trees will go back, the vegetation will grow back, but you can't replace lives and, any damage to people's homes, and then their investments there has a more of a societal risk. So that's changed. I think the amount of things that are at risk has increased. If you look at the population of Pennsylvania in 1920 or 1950, it was less than now. So there's more people in Pennsylvania. They live more places. They're moving out as suburbs expand. They're moving into that area where there are potential for wildfires, but they're also living there now. And so that's changed.
I would also assume the fact that there's more people wanting to enjoy the outdoors. We're hearing these numbers, especially since 2020, of more people discovering the outdoors. A lot of them are new and they might not know necessarily the rules, what to do with their fires or how to prevent wildfires.
That's part of it. I think generally people, like, if you're camping, are generally cognizant of the fact, okay, I got to be safe. I don't go to a state park with my wife and my kids and build a massive bonfire. I keep my fire small and try to keep it under control. And I think, just some basic education or educating yourself on that is important. Once you light that match and start that fire, it's hard to take it back, so to speak. So you're responsible for that fire that you started until it's extinguished. And hopefully you can keep it in the fire ring there and enjoy it and have no issues.
What can the average person do to prevent wildfires or support firefighters and land managers?
Yeah, I think the main thing, especially in Pennsylvania, is to be careful when you're using fire, whether that's a campfire or, any other type of burning at your home. I know people do burn to dispose of yard waste and that sort of thing, which is, in most of Pennsylvania, unless there's a local ordinance, it is generally legal. But don't burn what I call like noxious trash, so plastics, um, any kind of thing that it's more appropriate to dispose of, styrofoam, packaging material, construction debris, furniture. I see all kinds of things in fire reports sometimes that people are burning that they shouldn't be. Um, so be careful what you're burning, be careful where you're burning it, have the area cleared. I mentioned this before, but stay with your fire till it's out. You don't light a fire and then go inside and watch TV, or leave to go to the grocery store or something when you lit a fire at your house, which people do. And it's don't light a fire and then go to work and have nobody at home. It's a bad idea. You might get away with it now and then if it's wet, but if it's any kind of dry or windy, you're going to have problems. The other thing we saw this spring was lots of people want to make donations to their local fire departments of, food and water or whatever, which is good. And I'm sure it's appreciated. But I think, you hear from local fire departments, what they really need is year-round support. They do rely on a lot of donations. And if you really want to support local fire departments, the best thing to do is to make monetary donations. People get grants, but grants don't cover all the operating expenses and fuel costs and all those sort of things, training and personal protective equipment for firefighters. So donations are important. And then I think if you are able, I would encourage people to volunteer. I know there's been a pretty well-documented decrease in volunteer firefighters in Pennsylvania in the past, say, 40 to 50 years. And I think if you are able to get involved and volunteer, your help would be more than welcome.
Mike, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always want to encourage people to prevent wildfires and do what they can to help us out as best they can.
I want to thank my guest, Mike Kern, for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstahellbenders.com, or you can click support the show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.